Hey, good evening, guys. This is Matthew again. We're starting project 7, video tutorial 7, and so we're headed towards the finish line, so to speak. Although Web Design 2 is right around the corner, and so today we're going to be talking about boxes. The textbook calls this business boxes. But the real technical term for these things in web design, they're called divs, D-I-V-S. And I was kind of thinking about the importance of boxes in web design because boxes hold things, boxes hold content. If you're creating a website, you need a box to hold a logo in the top left-hand corner. You also need a box to hold the menu. And that menu you want to float to the right-hand side, and the logo you want to float to the left-hand side. And so what I'm trying to do here is just provide a little bit of context as far as the importance of understanding this concept of quote unquote boxes or divs in HTML. A box can hold an image, it can hold text, it can hold an iframe. A box does not exist also until you give it a dimension, until you create it, obviously, but you also have to give it a specific dimension. And so that leads to this initial step, actually, where you should probably sit down and maybe do some sketching with some graph paper, perhaps. Or if you have Adobe Illustrator, you can measure things out precisely to the exact pixel. This is all just context I'm giving you as far as the importance of these boxes and the way they all kind of fit together on a web page, almost kind of like a puzzle. And each of these boxes that are fitting together real snugly, and they all have exact math in relation to each other, they're holding things that you think are important regarding the user experience or the goal of that website. Um, with static HTML and CSS, it's really simple. You just design the width and the height of these boxes, and they are literally fitting together almost like puzzle pieces. But I also wanted to show you guys some additional context. And I know this is a jump forward, so just kind of take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's important that you see this so that you can see the way that boxes have sort of transitioned over time as far as more modern web development and web management. And so what I have here is actually the back end of my WordPress website. And you can almost kind of see there's a conceptual box holding this additional box that is called system messages. And below that, there's a container. You could call that a div or a box, and it's actually stretching from that corner to this corner, all the way down here, all the way down there. So you can see within this big box right here is a box holding the menu and the logo. But within that box are two additional boxes. There's one holding the logo that is floating left, and there is one holding the menu that is floating right. And then to the side of that, there's this box kind of spanning vertically up and down. And then there is a box holding another box. So you can kind of see, I mean, this is how web pages are sort of incised or cut or sliced. Maybe that's the best way to put it. You know, all these boxes are being sliced and kind of fit together and put inside of each other. They're being nested within each other. because sometimes it's easier to control a box when it's in a larger box, if that makes sense. So this is a leap forward, and believe it or not, we are moving to WordPress and web design too, and I'm going to be walking you through all this stuff. And I don't want you to be intimidated by it. It's actually quite simple, believe me. It's the reason why web designers and web developers are actually paid a lot of money. Everyone thinks that this stuff is so complicated. It's really not, especially in this day and age, because the user experience regarding WordPress is really good. But make no mistake, this conceptual idea of boxes, it's not really going away. It's going to be in WordPress as well. So I'm going to log out of my WordPress site. I'm going to close it out. And then let's go take a look at the textbook. So boxes, that's the journey that we're going on regarding this web tutorial. This is a really important page right here because a div or a box does not exist until you make it, okay? And the only way you can see a div is by giving it a dimension, a width and a height, and a background color, actually, okay? The background color, as you're working here, it's handy so that you can actually see the divs. But at the end of the day, for example, if you're looking at an older website that's pure HTML and CSS, at some point the background colors are removed. And so all of these boxes working together on the screen, it's seamless. It's almost kind of like some sort of a trick. The web developer is structuring all of this content, but they're not showing you how it's stitched together or how it fits together. And they remove that reveal when they remove the background color. For the purpose of this project, I would advise that you give every single one of your divs a height, a width, and a background color. Okay? Before we move on to some of these details as far as building boxes, I want to discuss the example or the notes that I've provided for you. So let me back up for a second, and I'm going to open up my HTML page in brackets. Oops, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to start fresh, so I know that I'm using the right files. That's really, really important. You may have noticed that it's easy to get confused in web design if you have multiple files open from different project folders. And so you got to make sure you have the right files open when you're doing this business. So again, open with brackets. I'm going to go back and I'm going to open up the CSS file with brackets. So now I can see, I need to see both of these guys simultaneously while I'm working. As another review, if you look at this HTML file in the header portion of the document, you will see this link that is pointing to the style sheet, okay? CSS/styles. Now, I've actually created this pretty simply. I'm just going to sort of walk you guys through this. I think this is a great initial exercise. And by the way, I trust that you'll find a way to perhaps work a div into your CV or resume project, okay? But I also would advise that maybe you just try a separate project where you are playing and practicing putting these divs together or fitting them into each other. This particular file, of course, has a body, like any HTML document. And then I have told that body to have a red background. And I did that on the styles CSS document. And it was one of the first things that I did. I kind of, in general, when I'm doing CSS, I work broadly, and then I get more specific as I'm moving downward. First thing I did was I assigned a font that I wanted to use, and that was discussed in the last video, right? So this one is going to be using Arial, then Verdana, and then sans serif. Okay. Here is where I specify the background color of the body. And I actually like these little guys. For some reason, it makes me a little more comfortable when these brackets, when this bracket is on the bottom. Sometimes in the code in the book, they put it right here, but I like it on the bottom because to me, that really represents closure, like I'm starting something new. Okay. We're all going to have our own little quirks about how we code. That's one of mine. So there's this big, huge body background that is red. And the first div that I made is this sort of turquoise cyan div. And so let's take a look and see what's happening. The first thing I did was I centered the main sort of container or div. And I did it with this line of code. It's really nice. Margin, 0, and then auto. And that essentially will put that div right smack in the middle. In fact, when I stretch this out or move it, it's still going to be in the center because of that command. Okay. The next thing that I did was I gave it that background color so that I can see it. So here it is, background color, cyan. And that's where this turquoise cyan is coming from. Then I gave it a specific width and height. Then I just started playing around with some other commands that I've become familiar with or I've learned in previous chapters, like text align left. But then I started kind of playing with some new commands. In fact, oops, that's a mistake right there. Border color only needs to be there once, so that's a typo. It's not harming anything, but it's not helping either, so I deleted it. So now we've started kind of walking through this document, but I think at this point, if I'm going to talk about borders and that sort of thing, I better go back to the textbook a little bit. You can limit width and height. There's a command. That would be a circumstance where you have only so much room to plug in some text, or you don't want the website to be 100% the width of the screen. Instead, you want it to be 75% the width of the screen. So minimum width and max width can be useful. I'm actually not really using it too much, I think, in this document right here, although I did use max width over here on the tertiary div, the third div, okay? You can do the same thing with limiting height, minimum height, max height. Overflowing content. The one that can be really useful is this one that is with scroll here. So if you create a div and then you plug a bunch of text into it, but it's just too much text and it won't fit in the div, a little scrolly thing that you can grab with your hand, your mouse hand here, will appear, well, just like this one, right? It will appear so that you can scroll through the text, okay? And so that's the one that I think is mostly useful for your potential project, okay? And it's actually being shown down here with the Gibson Les Paul text. This is a really, really important page right here because it's showing you a beautiful diagram and showing you how a box is built. Initially, when you build a div, this is the box, that's the div. But then there's a border associated with a box. If you give that div a border, you don't have to have a border, you don't have to have a margin, and you don't have to have a padding. Those are optional, those are add-ons. By default, you always get the black box, okay? But you can start adding on to your div with a border, a margin, and a padding. And this is so beautiful because it's just a great diagram showing, really illustrating how a box can build out potentially. Now, remember, I was talking about divs and boxes fitting together and it being a very mathematical thing. If you do build out your box, you have to start adding up. Okay, well, I gave this box a 5. This box is, I don't know, 100 by 300. But then I gave it a border of 10, which is a lot. I know that's a lot. And so if there's a border of 10, then I have to add that to the width and the height of my box. So instead of it being 100, it's actually going to be 120 because there's 10 on top and 10 on bottom. If it's 300 wide, it's actually going to be 320 because there's 10 pixels of border on the left-hand side and 10 pixels of border on the right-hand side. That concept moves through the idea of adding a margin and a padding as well. So whenever you add these things, you have to do the math, and you can't just do it on one side because there are two sides moving left and right to a box or div, or on the top and the bottom, okay? So that math aspect is so important, and I'm going to give you a hint, especially for Project 8, okay? Because for Project 8, you actually are going to be building out and nesting divs to create some sort of a website layout, okay? And hint, 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 if you have graph paper and you can do the math on graph paper and you can see it visually, it's going to help you a lot because you have to make sure all these parts fit like a glove. So that's border, margin, and padding business. And again, this gorgeous diagram that really illustrates how it works. Here it's kind of showing how margin and padding can actually be useful in design. It's not, the end goal is not necessarily just to kind of fit these pieces together, but we're also trying to create a pleasant user experience for folks. And so the one on the left with margin and padding is more pleasant and user friendly compared to the one on the right. As I mentioned earlier, border width adds to the dimensions or the math regarding a div or box. So be mindful of that. Border styles. I actually did add a border style, show you guys, to the primary div here. See the dashed line? That's actually a black border, but it has a dashed line. I'm going to show you the code. Here is the border color. Okay. Here I've given the border a width of 2 pixels so that it is pretty visible. Here is the border style where I've made it dashed. And notice how the corners on some of these other divs that I've made, they're perfectly square, but these are actually rounded. And I did that with this command right there, border radius. Okay. We'll see that as we move along in the textbook. So border style, you saw how I used that, but there are many options that you can explore. I would suggest that you try all of them. You know, these projects are an opportunity to try and do things. You learn by doing, you learn by experimenting. And you never really know until you give it a shot. And so hopefully you're able to put on some headphones and after you've had supper so that you're kind of relaxed, you sit in front of your machine and you get some work done. Border color, I showed you guys that right here. I happen to have made my border a simple black because I wanted it to be visible, but the sky's the limit, as you know. Here, you can actually get really meticulous. You can make the top border a certain color or the right border a certain color. So I'll leave those details up to you, but all of the information is in the textbook and it's clear as day. Shorthand is really important, I think. Notice how with one command regarding the border, that particular border is being told to be 3 pixels wide, dotted, and a particular color. And so that's the advantage of shorthand. And so you might want to give that a shot. Okay. Now here's the big deal, padding, right? We've talked about borders, and that's going to add a little bit of math to your divs and your boxes, but padding might end up adding quite a bit more. And so I want you guys to, the initial margin or padding that I added to the first div, let's take a look at this. There's actually some default browser padding at the top here, and that's why this is being pushed down. But otherwise, the margin I've set to 0, and then I said auto. And so that just simply centers the div, okay? That puts it right smack in the center, and that's not a bad thing. But then with these sort of following divs that I added, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I consistently added 32 pixels of margin. 1, 2, 3. So there's that 32 pixels right there. I don't know if you guys can see it. And then here's 32. And then here's 32 again. Right? Now, notice how this one, it's more like 64. How did that happen? I mean, this is only 32, this is only 32, but that's a lot of space right there. That's double. Well, let's take a look here. I'm looking for, here it is right here. Padding left. I was looking in the wrong location. So there's 32 pixels of margin, meaning all around, but then I actually specified only 32 pixels of padding left, so on the left-hand side, okay? And so that adds up. 32 and 32 is 64, right, guys? And this is an example of me talking about how you really have to be mindful of the math. By the way, I'd like to get out my calculator for a second. I want to show you guys something really quickly. 1024, it has been said, is the magic number for a website. Divide that by 2 is 512. 512 divided by 2 is 256. 256 divided by 2 is 128. Divided by 2 is 64. Divided by 2 is 32. It's no accident that I'm using these numbers that just happen to kind of work with the screen. And so please write that down. Write 1024, okay? 1024 to start with. And then you can just break it down by cutting it in half, cutting it in half. And in fact, 32, of course, will turn into 16, and 16 will turn into 8. And you can start using those smaller numbers to develop margin and padding that will add up appropriately so that you can eventually have a perfect puzzle that is 1024 wide. I know, I mean, if you're OCD, you're going to love this stuff. If you like math, or if you kind of like math, you'll learn to love it. If you don't like math so much, you might struggle a little bit with these divs. And so I would advise you to sit down and with some graph paper something where you can visually see it, because I'm an artist. I'm a very visual person, so I have to see things in order to work them out. Okay. That's why I love these YouTube videos, because you guys can, you're seeing everything, you're hearing me talk. The content is being reinforced with quiz questions and the textbook, and I'm basically trying to work you guys from all angles so that this information really sinks in. Okay. But at the end of the day, we are artists, so we are very visual folks. 1024 is that big magic number, and then you can break it down to get all the way down to 8 or 4. It's absolutely amazing. So I got a little excited about that, excuse me, but I do get excited about nerdy things like that. So there's that margin, and it's adding up, and I'm showing you guys how it's adding up. I've also aligned the text left. Okay. I'm giving that div a particular width and a height because that's the rule. Here's the color that I've given it, magenta, so I know which one is which. If you gave all of these divs the same color, that could be really confusing. You need to give those divs different colors so that you can see what's going on. The following div is this yellow one, indicated here. It's yellow. It has a margin of 32 pixels. And when you just say margin 32, that means that margin is actually going to wrap all around. By default, by the way, things are going to want to move or sit on the left-hand side. Look, this text is trying to sit on the left-hand side, but it can't because of this margin. The same thing is happening here with this div. It's trying to sit all the way over, but it can't. But believe me, things want to move left naturally. That box is 224 by 224. The other thing that's kind of really exciting about all these divs is you really get a sense of the real estate space on a page. You start to kind of know what 200 pixels looks like, or what 100 pixels looks like. Here's that all margin again. And this is the last div, the green one. I've made it lawn green for fun. Believe it or not, that is a color. Okay. I gave this one a max width and a height, text align left, and I gave this one a border of black, 2 pixels, dashed, border radius, 10 pixels. So there's that. I think there's actually something else that I sort of blitzed over a little bit too quickly. Let's go to the, we've spent a lot of time looking at the CSS, but let's look at the code for a moment. In the main primary div ID equals main, there's an unordered list. And as you guys know, usually when you create a list, it reads vertically. And I think in a previous video, I did hint, hey, a list can become a menu, by the way, as long as you tell it to read horizontally instead of vertically. And that's exactly what I've done. But come down here. I did it right here with the list items, display inline. And in addition to that, I gave each of those list items some margin, only on the right-hand side. And the reason being is so that the text gets pushed over a little bit. Because if I didn't have this margin right, all of them would just practically be sitting on top of each other. They'd all be squinched in. So I got to give them a little bit of breathing room, some space. And I did that with margin right. Okay. Let's go back to the textbook and make sure that we didn't miss anything. So we talked about padding. Margin is a very similar thing. You can compare the two with that diagram, please. You can also, again, only have margin on the top, only on the right. It depends on what you need, okay? There's also a shorthand way to describe the margin for a box, and that's right here. It can be useful. Here it's talking about aligning or centering content. I believe that I talked about that a little bit here with zero and auto. Okay. Well, I mean, this is an awkward thing or page to look at because IE stands for Internet Explorer, which is essentially the Black Death of web development. And of course, no offense to PC users, but it is um, it's a it's not a Mac thing, I'll tell you that. Okay. Um, Internet Explorer was the default browser that for years and years and years came on a PC. And um, it gave web developers a lot of problems. Sometimes things just would not work. Okay. Or it was sort of a unique circumstance. And it basically caused web developers sometimes a lot of stress. I'm sure that you guys have gone, like, even on Blackboard, at Diné College. And I think there's a note on the front page of Blackboard where it advises the type of browser that you should be using. And the reason being is because not all browsers are made the same. That's the truth of it. Google Chrome is pretty good, Mozilla is pretty good, and Internet Explorer has now been deprecated. Thank God they finally put it in a coffin and it's totally gone, which indicates how this book is a little older. But I think it's just kind of fun to talk about. We talked about Flash being put in a coffin, and now we're talking about Internet Explorer being put into a coffin. Maybe that's my dark sense of humor. The inline block business, well, what did we just do? We created a menu with this information right here. As a reminder, display, inline, display, inline, margin right, 10 pixels. Okay. You can totally hide things. Yeah. Notice how one of the menu items is just disappeared. So yeah, you can pull tricks like that. I would not do something like that personally. I guess if you're developing a page and you don't want the user to have access to it, you can still have it there and then you can hide it temporarily. But the truth is that's really more of an old school HTML thing. It's not as useful in contemporary web development, i.e. WordPress. I'm not going to talk about border images. I just kind of think that's a bit too much. But if you want to experiment with this, you can. I would never do this. It's just not my style. I'm my whole entire aesthetic as a designer is a little bit more austere, direct, raw, um, clear. I'm not interested in unnecessary bells and whistles, and to me, that's what this is. So I'll just leave that comment there. I could say something similar for box shadows, but I know that there are probably some folks who want to use them. It's okay. I'm not going to get upset if I see you using a drop shadow. But just keep in mind that there's a saying in design that kind of spans all sorts of different types of design, whether it's architecture or publication or even like urban planning, whatever. And that's form follows function. And so when you add a drop shadow or when you think about doing this bell and whistle business, my advice is to ask yourself, is it really helping? Or am I just doing it because? So Google that, Google that phrase, form follows function, and research it a bit because it's actually really important as far as being a contemporary modern designer in this day and age. I do like these rounded corners because it just kind of softens things up a little bit. And so I did use that in a couple circumstances that I told you guys about. And there's one right there. Okay. I'll show it to you, the actual render as well. There's a rounded corner right there. And again, there's a rounded corner right there. By the way, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys is really amazing. That's what they're talking about here. This is one of those fancy schmancy things that I probably wouldn't mess around with, but it's here for you if you're inclined to mess around with it. But to me, I think a real nice clean border does the job, okay? That's pretty much it for the box chapter. And I'm going to be really honest. I was kind of looking through chapter 14, and it does have a few useful things. The most important or useful thing that I would see or that I would consider is actually this first page right here, where you can actually customize how your list is going to look. So list style type, I think, is actually really, that's great. And you can change things, here's all the information so that you can change it. But again, I would never add an image for a bullet. I would never use like little stars. That's just not, it's not me. It might be you guys, but it's just not me. And so I invite you guys to cruise through this chapter and take a look. But even on the PDF, a lot of this business I have stated as quote unquote optional, because I think it's just sort of window dressing. Yeah, if you want to sort of think of when I'm talking about form follows function and austere design, raw design, direct design, do me a favor and Google the term brutalist architecture, and then click on the images, the images text via Google, and just admire all the gorgeous cast concrete and the way it's so direct. Nothing is hidden in that architecture. There's no unnecessary window dressing associated with that kind of design. It's very direct and raw and real. But again, I'm not here to make you guys clones of me. But I honestly, I feel that it's necessary that I talk about these perspectives on design, because you guys are all developing your own personal voice as you work with me. So there is a longer table. Obviously, that could be useful. So you might want to take a look at that one. That wraps up chapter 7. The big thing that you really need to focus on, that I think is just the cat's meow of project 7, is boxes and divs. And so I am going to give you this to review and to take a look at. And again, keep in mind that this div is holding that div, and that div is holding this div, and this div is holding that div. So these guys are all nested within each other. And I could start putting more divs inside of those divs if they were the right dimensions. But I'm trying to ease you into this boxes div business before we move to project 8. Okay. And I'm also trying to give you an idea of how a website layout is constructed and how these boxes are essentially arranged to hold particular types of content, which is where we're going next. And I think it's kind of a fun place. So give me a moment. First of all, I'm going to close this. And this is sort of a teaser as to what I'm about to show you. But in addition to this notes folder, there's also the OB1 folder. Okay. And so within this OB1 folder, of course, as per usual, there's an index file. But first things, I don't want to get confused. So I got to close out these other guys. It's my duty to close those out so I don't get confused. So I'm going to come back here to my Finder, and I've selected a new folder or a new web project folder. And I'm going to open up my index and brackets. And furthermore, I'm going to open up my CSS file in brackets. Again, if I look at in the header portion of the document, there is a line of code that is establishing communication between the styles.css and this HTML document. Those two guys need to be talking to each other. They need to be in the passenger and the driver's seat of a vehicle going on a long trip together, having great conversation. If someone is in the back seat or if someone is in a separate vehicle, it's just not going to work. Okay. These guys need to be right next to each other talking. That's what that's all about. Now, so that's the index file. And what I really wanted to show you guys was that a div can actually hold content. There's really two types of content, for the most part, that a div is going to hold. One is an image, and the second is text. You guys are pros at text at this point. You're pretty good at images too. But now all you have to do is put that stuff into boxes and arrange it. Learn how to arrange it. And so all I'm doing right here is I'm creating two divs. Div ID equals ob1 image. And the second one, div ID equals ob1 quote. Now let's take a look at the style sheet. Yeah, here it is. Div, and it's not a class attribute, it's an ID attribute, and that's why there are pound signs. So I kind of threw you guys a curveball there. But again, there's that old friend, margin auto. That's why ob1 is right smack in the middle there. So if I stretch this out, he's going to sort of go along with that, right? The background color is actually blue, not magenta. All right. But you don't see the background blue because it's being covered up by the image, if that makes sense. And by the way, this text right here, this is not HTML text. That is actually, that's an image that I made. So you can kind of see, I'm trying to grab that image. That is a PNG image that I made. Okay, I'll show it to you right now. It's in the images folder as it should be. ob-image PNG. I can open this with my preview file or software. So that's the image that I'm throwing in there. And I wanted to tell you guys, hey, this image is 400 by 500. Well, look at the width and the height of the div that I created. It's 400 by 500. Boom. It's going to fit in there perfectly. I've got that covered. But I want to create another div and I want to put some content in there. And that one is going to have an orange background that I can see. Okay. And it has a width of 400, similar to this one, but the height is quite a bit less. It's only 200 pixels high. And it has a margin. Okay. So yeah, that's the CSS. The background color is gray. I added a font family command for the body portion of the document. All of this should look pretty familiar at this point. We've been talking about it a few or several times, even in the last project. Going back to our HTML file, we can see that there is an H3. Following that, there is some paragraph text. I modified this document earlier today because I also wanted to illustrate to you all or show you that images can be clickable. So there's a div was created, and there's actually an href associated with this image. So if I click on ob1, notice how when I put my cursor over there, it turns into a little pointer guy, a little index finger. And if I click on that, it's going to take me to the Obi-Wan Kenobi Wikipedia page, which of course is right here. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to show you guys as clearly as possible how this stuff can be useful to you. Now, I know that you guys are working on a CV or a resume, and the real truth is this project 7, I'm not going to lie to you, it's probably the last moment in Web Design 1 where you're going to be thinking about the CV or the resume. So whatever you upload for this project, it needs to be finalized. It needs to have a profile image of you, hopefully. It needs to have everything. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm going to clear up one other thing. I know I'm kind of getting squirrely today. When you upload a project, let's say you're working, I've completed OB1. Let's say I have to send this to you. I have to send you this entire file. I'm not just going to send you this, the index file. If I just send you the index.html file, it's not going to work. In fact, I'm going to make a copy of this and I'm going to put it over here. And I'm going to open it up. And I guarantee you, it's going to look a lot different. Look at this. So if you don't send me the entire web folder, this is what I'm going to see on my end. You need to send me the whole entire web environment. And in order to do so, you need to compress a folder. You need to compress or zip a folder, dependent on the type of machine that you're on. If I'm on a Mac, so what I need to do is I just right click and then I say compress. And this is the file that I would upload to Blackboard because it has everything inside of it. Same here. Compress. This is the one that I would upload to Blackboard because it has everything inside of it. So I just want to reiterate that when you guys are uploading files, make sure that you're sending me everything in that web environment. Okay? Yeah, that's project 7, and project 8 is going to be that puzzle business. And so you might even want to get a head start on that. I'll leave that up to you. Remember that magic number 1024 and breaking things down. And think about precedent websites. Think about where a logo always is, or where a menu always is, or where a banner always is, or where a secondary menu always is. You're not reinventing the wheel here, folks. Believe me, you don't need to. In fact, if you reinvented the wheel and you started putting a logo on the bottom of a web page, it wouldn't be good, trust me. Folks would not be happy. There's a reason things are the way they are. And this is not one of those circumstances where you should push back and say, well, I'm going to do it my way. Please don't think that. You need to. The thing about being a designer is that it's a very collaborative and community-based process. So you need to listen to what the client has been experiencing and what the client wants. Unless the client wants or needs a logo in the lower right-hand corner of a web page, then you should not put it there. That's my advice. Okay, have a good day. Bye-bye.